Justin Vaïsse, Director General and founder of the Paris Peace Forum, as though there were any question where in the world we are right now. Great to see you, by the way. This is becoming an annual tradition, and I like it.
Exactly. I would miss it if it didn't happen this year, Tony.
Well, I am here, I promise you. And as the 8th edition gets underway, I just want to ask you a few questions about the themes of this forum and some of the things happening in the world right now that you're reacting to. This year, you're calling the forum New Coalitions for Peace, People, and the Planet. New coalitions. Does that imply that the old ones are failing?
Let's say it's not that they're failing, it's the assessment that the country that inspired, underwrote, and sustained the world of institutions, of norms, of solidarity mechanisms as well, that we have lived in for the past decades is, and I mean the US, is turning its back on that system and is telling us that this system of international norms, of multilateral institutions, is actually detrimental to the US interest, and sometimes is not just becoming indifferent to that system, but also sometimes poking holes into the system by withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement or from WHO or from UNESCO just across the river here. And so that brings the question that it's in America's right to, let's say, withdraw or criticize that system. But for the rest of us who think that this system of norms and institution has been good for trying to address some of the global challenges, then who do we work with? And so that brings the theme of new coalitions. That is, with whom are we going to sustain the effort on climate change? 10 years after the Paris Climate Agreement, with whom are we going to sustain the 1.5 or 2 degrees objective? With whom are we going to sustain the global health challenge and the fact that we still need to act on pandemics, we still need to act on immunization, etc. And more generally, as we live in a world of changing realities and balances, with whom are we doing new alliances? Is it with India and Brazil, for example? What is the role of China in all of that, etc.? So it's a sort of question mark on what is the world that Trump is ushering in, leaving us with, and who should we be working with?
So I was going to ask you that very question. Where do you see these new coalitions beginning to form, and what impact do you think that's going to have on the next decade or so of geopolitics?
Evidently a number of countries or regions share a common interest in not being coerced or limited or constrained by the US-China competition. They don't want to depend on one of the two superpowers. They don't want to take sides. They want to keep good relations with, for example, the US, but also be open to China without depending on any of them. And so I think that's the case. That's the general description that would fit Europe, certainly. That would fit countries like Brazil, like South Africa, like India, and others, like the Gulf. Sometimes we hear about multi-alignment, and I think that's very fair, but multi-alignment means you don't depend on one of the two superpowers. And so I think naturally, and that's a very general answer, we need to get into the weeds of each issue coalition. But more generally, I think that these countries share a common interest, which doesn't mean that they are rejecting the US, for example. It just means that given what we have in terms of the US administration refusing or reneging, I would say, on its traditional duties and obligations, then let's try to find common ground, and whether it's on climate or health or AI, let's try to work together.
I do want to ask you, though, to some extent, and I believe you were the one who said this, and I read this in another interview that you did, the US was the world's sheriff, and there was a negative connotation to that. People saying that America is intervening in places where it doesn't belong, Iraq being one example that comes to mind. And now as the US retreats from the global stage, there's just as much criticism coming from the other side. So it's kind of like a damned if you do and damned if you don't. Is there a sort of a Goldilocks situation for US involvement?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure it's exactly that. That's so in the 1990s and 2000s, when the US hegemony was uncontested, and you had authors like Bob Kagan writing about power and weakness, comparing Europe with the US, saying that the US was the indispensable power, was a benevolent hegemon, etc. I tended to pretty much agree with that. That is to say, I was thinking at the time that it was a pity that Europe would not be more in history, etc. And I would say, yeah, sometimes the sheriff overreaches, sometimes the hegemon does things that we don't like. Vietnam War, Iraq War, for example. So we don't have the best hegemon you can think of, but it's still a pretty good one. And why is it a pretty good one? Because as an Australian author wrote in the 1990s, he wrote this piece called American Hegemony, or the Pretense of Concert. That is to say, the American hegemony was clothed in this web of multilateralism, of consultation of allies, sometimes differing to their opinions, sometimes not, but at least creating a world in which national interests could be accommodated nicely. And that is something that had not existed in history before, this sort of enlightenment. And indeed, that is the world that America created, that allowed the rise of China, that allowed the rise of the emerging powers. The word of globalization, right, was underwritten by the Pentagon, by the US Treasury, by the opening of sea lanes, by the 11 aircraft carrier groups, etc., right? So at that time, I was more attentive to this argument that the sheriff was a necessary evil, if you'd like, because it at least ordered the world. Now that we don't have that anymore, and Trump has been very clear on the fact that he wanted to get back to being a nation, not an empire, right? And so in the balancing of the collective responsibilities of the first power on the one hand and narrowly defined national interest, it chooses the latest. MAGA is all about putting forward very concrete, transactional, generally money-related interests. And in this world, I think many people have to lose because precisely, and I'm not going to lecture a media that is called GZERO on world order, right? Because it's exactly the point. That is, it's a world where the sheriff says, I'm no longer doing that. Now I'm using my gun to just secure my own interest. And I'm not going to enforce international law. I'm not going to, police the Middle East. I'm not going to be the lender of last resort in financial crisis, etc. And the world is changing because of that. And that, I think many people will come to regret the time of the US sheriff or the world policeman, as he was said in a derogatory way. And so my point now is to say, what do we do instead? So how do we order the G0 world, right? And so new coalitions is one way to answer that big question, but it's thrust upon us. We've seen multiplication of conflicts, and that's no chance. It's a G0 world. I think we are now up to 61 open conflicts, including 10 wars. I mean, just a few weeks ago, we had Afghanistan and Pakistan fighting one another. It's a new hotspot. And so in this world, how do we bring order? How do we bring peace? How do we bring solidarity, etc.? That's the big question that we'll be tackling here.
Yes, and so you spoke a little bit in the beginning about the United States' role in the establishment of so many of these multilateral organizations that came out of World War II. Do you see an opportunity right now with the kind of geopolitical conflict and kinetic wars that are happening, as you mentioned, all around, that there could be an emergence of some sort of new understanding of global cooperation?
I'm very much hoping for that. And I noticed that many organizations, like the Rockefeller Foundation, has just launched an exercise in that. Many other think tanks or governments or foundations are trying to think about what could be a world order that is adapted. Because let's remember that just a couple of years ago, criticism to world order were everywhere, but mostly coming from the global south. It was criticism by India, Brazil, and others. It was the Bridgetown Agenda a few years ago, led by Prime Minister Mia Mottley, who will be here, and other ways to criticize world order as it had been organized by Western powers and criticizing Western domination. But now the threat to world order comes from the other side, comes from the country that organized it and I think benefited from it the most. And so now the question is, on which principles do we rebuild this order? I don't think we can rebuild it in the sense of having a tabula rasa, having a blank check, because there's no situation that allows us to reform international institutions. But maybe there are a number of practices that we could adopt that will not resemble necessarily the old order, but that will at least pacify international relations and also replace what we used to call development aid, right? That's another big agenda that we have. That is to say, now that US aid has been destroyed, now that European aid budgets have decreased, what do we do? And how do we not just replace this, but rethink development aid as we know, and many articles have been written on that point, the very concept of development aid is not really longer valid as it used to be from the 60s to the 2000s. And so we need to rethink this, and forums such as the 8th edition of the forum are just made up for that.
Well, let me ask you a question about France. President Macron, one of the few European leaders who's truly trying to be global right now, in fact, hosting forums like this one, however, facing a lot of domestic issues here, political pushback and opposition, cabinet shakeups and shuffling. How is that impacting France's ability to lead globally?
Not so much. That's the interesting. I mean, I've noticed that in my travels or in my exchanges with foreign partners, people are always asking me a question on the turbulences, the political turbulences in France. But then right after that question, they forget it and they're interested in what type of leadership or of energy Macron can inject in the system. Because I think that's one of the secrets of that multilateral system or multi-actor system. It's the fact that it works if some of the leaders are taking their responsibilities and crystallizing ideas, policy consensus, or leading the way, convening people, whether it's on, 2 years ago, the Summit for a New Financial Pact, which was a way to answer to countries from the Global South about debt, increasing debt, and about the sort of injustice of international multilateral organizations and the way the World Bank or the IMF were working or not working very, very well, or on climate issues and others. And Macron has been, I think, providing that for a number of years, convening people. He has constant visits here at the Elysee. He's constantly texting African leaders, Asian leaders, President Trump as well, several times a week. I know that he is exchanging with him on many different issues. And that is something that is sort of in the public interest, that they be movement in the system, that the system otherwise tends to stop and to stand still. And I think he will continue to do that until he's out of power a year and a half from now.
Justin Vaïsse, thanks so much. Best of luck this week.
Thank you, Tony.
Yeah,
Thanks.
good to see you.
Good to see you too.